So, welcome everyone. I'm Ali. I'm from Astris Labs, and this is a webinar that Astris Labs has put together with in collaboration with the Cloud Appreciation Society. And this one is our second in our series. We did one maybe half a year ago that was a bit more technical, maybe, and a bit more about clouds and the science behind clouds. And this one is looking much more at psychology of scientists and how the weather affects our minds and our mental health. So we've got a great guest today, Trevor Harley, and I will let Gavin introduce him. So without further ado, I will get Trevor on stage and I'll get myself off stage so that it can start. And as I say, for anyone that came in late, it's great to see all the welcomes and everything in the Q&A. Try and use the Q&A for questions that hopefully will get answered in the last, let's say, third of the hour. And there's also live streams on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube, which you can also join and join in the conversation there. So I'll pass over to Trevor now and Gavin. And
Great. Brilliant. I think I need to spotlight me as well. Hi everyone. My name is Gavin Pretor-Pinney. I'm member number one of the Cloud Appreciation Society, and that's a society of tens of thousands of people based in 120 countries around the world who all feel very strongly about clouds, who are emotionally connected to the sky and believe the clouds are one of the most beautiful aspects of nature. Which is why I'm really excited to be speaking today to Trevor Harley. Trevor Harley is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Dundee in Scotland, and he's also author of this book, Head in the Clouds, which has a subtitle, How the Weather Affects Our Minds and Mental Health. And this is going to be featuring a bit in our discussions, very central to the subject today. So hello, Trevor. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, it's a pleasure and welcome everybody. And it's good to be among so many like-minded people who love the clouds and the sky.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think I'm the only one, so it's good to be with others like me.
You're
Obsessed with the
among,
weather, obsessed with the sky. It's wonderful.
yeah.
And I'm member 1262, I think.
Oh, you are. God, that's amazing. That's wonderful news, Trevor. I would have put your member number after your name if I'd known that. I didn't realize you were already a member of the society.
Yes.
Great to have you in that way as well. So, Trevor, you describe yourself as a psychometeorologist. And you say that, one of the world's few psychometeorologists. So, what
Yes,
exactly is a psychometeorologist? And, how did you end up specializing in that?
it's a word I made up, although I
Ah,
discovered that there is someone also who describes themselves as a sociometeorologist, which looks more at the sociology of the weather. And the name means it's the combination of psychology and the weather. And particularly, it's about how does the weather influence us? And we'll probably talk about that in some detail later. How I got into it, well, it's a long story. As a child, all of my earliest memories were to do with the weather. The very first thing I remember was being out with my father in London in a thunderstorm. And I was just absolutely terrified of these brilliant flashes of lightning. The rain really came down viciously. And when we got home soaked, my mother said that thunder was the sound of God being angry with me,
oh my
which
word.
contributed to my phobia even more. But when I was about 7 or 8, that phobia disappeared. And then there were other memories, like I just about remember the Great Freeze of 1962 and 63, and waking up to see the scenery completely transformed by the snow. I'd never seen anything like it before. And then I think I was probably about 8 or 9. I was walking home from school and I just saw this cloud, which I now know to be a cumulus, growing. It seemed to be growing in front of my eyes. And I watched it going up and I wanted to understand why it was doing that. And then when I thought about it, I realized I didn't know what clouds were even. In fact, I then realized I didn't know anything about the weather. I kept on asking adults what the wind was, and no one seemed to know. They would fob me off with answers like, it's God moving things around. My mother was very keen on invoking God in explanations of natural phenomena. And so it was, I think it was this obsession, early obsession with trying to understand the world that made me interested in science.
Brilliant.
So I did a natural science degree at Cambridge, and then I lapsed into psychology. And it took me about 20, 30 years before I realized that I could actually combine my two great passions by looking at how psychology and the weather, and particularly how the psychology affects us, how it affects our mood, our temperament, our mental illness, our personality development, all aspects of our behavior.
Great. Well, I mean, that is precisely what we're going to be focusing on here. Now, your book, Head in the Clouds, which is just going to be coming out soon, has two focuses. One is the empirical evidence about how the weather affects us. And we're talking about, peer-reviewed academic studies. And so I want to touch on that as we go through discussing this subject. But it's also a very personal book, and you interweave your personal narrative in the book, and you write very candidly about depression and anxiety, ADHD, autism spectrum. Why did you choose, just very briefly, to interweave the two?
Because for me, they are intimately connected. And I've always found it hard to distinguish work from life. Being an academic, you're always working, you're always reading papers. You're saying you're on a holiday, but really you're just scrolling through all the latest academic publications. But it works the other way too. Life gets interleaved with work. And they particularly say of psychologists that they study psychology to heal themselves and sort themselves out. I think in my case, there is an aspect of truth in that. I did my PhD on slips of the tongue, speech errors, Freudian slips, why we make mistakes of the tongue, mistakes in speech. And if you listen carefully, you will doubtless notice that I will make many slight speech errors and be slightly disfluent. I've got a very slight stutter. In fact, when I was young, I had to have speech therapy. When I was 6, I couldn't say the words Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia. I don't know why they were keen to get me to say those words, but I couldn't say them. So I had speech therapy. And it was that. Then I thought, when I was doing psychology, it's something that speech production is under researched. And in the same way, the psychology of the weather, how the weather affects us, is under researched. And I think things always make more sense when they're in a personal context. And for me, things like seasonal affective disorder, I understand because I suffer from it myself. And therefore, I want to understand the mechanisms, but also I can illustrate what is going on with personal anecdotes. And I think science works best when it's at the personal level.
Great. So this idea of how the weather affects us emotionally is something I want to do a quick poll about. I'm going to mention in a moment about your first memory of your emotional state being affected by the weather involving wind, and a memory of your grandmother. But first, I want to launch a poll, and I wonder, Ali, if you could help do that. It's the first poll, and this is really about how you, as attendees of this webinar, and this is something only those in the Zoom webinar will be able to answer, tell us how these weather types affect your mood. We'd love to just get a little an idea of this. It's very simple, only take a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes to just answer whether sunshine, clouds, rain, wind, thunderstorms, hot weather, cold weather lift your mood, lower your mood, or have little effect. So we'd love to get you to answer those when we're speaking. Trevor, tell me about the first time you remember coming to a realization of your own mental health that was triggered by wind.
In retrospect, I realized that I was a very curious child in both respects. And I was very anxious. I was terrified of so many things. And I think thunder was the very first, what we now label as a phobia I had. But I was also afraid of black dogs, television aerials, which were indoor things then, sockets, power sockets. So I had a lot of fear. But then when I was about 8, I think, I was in my grandmother's kitchen and she was out putting the washing on the washing line. And I distinctly remember that the Tremolo's Silence is Golden was playing on the radio at the same time. So it's a very vivid memory, what psychologists call flashbulb memories, when everything seems to be downloaded to the brain, and we have something, remember something extremely vividly and emotionally. And as I was watching the wind billowing the white sheets around and on the line, I suddenly felt completely overcome by, and I found it very difficult to describe as a child, aged 9 or so. And I think I called it nostalgia for some reason. It must have been a word that I had recently come across, but I now recognize to be a feeling of depression, hopelessness, despair, meaninglessness. And it's wrong to think that children can't experience these things. It can be very powerful. And in my case, I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't mention it to anyone else. And fortunately, it went away for a while, but came back much worse much later. But now I always associate the wind with depression. And whenever it gets, that's one reason why the wind is my least favorite sort of weather. I try and enjoy everything about the weather, but I do struggle when it comes to the wind.
Okay, so we'll be seeing how other people feel about the wind in a moment when we share the results of that. 368 people in this webinar, so we could have a reasonably good number to focus on there.
Yes, and I
So
should say that these sort of polls, although we're not a random sample, but we are people who self-professedly like the weather. That one reason why there aren't many psychometeorologists around, is that there hasn't been a lot of research in the area. So even we don't know the answers to some of the most obvious questions, like the ones we're asking. So it will be very interesting to see the results.
yeah. Well, we can see them right now, and we've got an overwhelming 89% of people saying that sunshine lifts their mood. That won't surprise you. And also, given the self-selecting group we have here, we have 79% saying clouds lift their mood. I wonder how that would compare to the general public. We have got the Cloud Appreciation Society members and followers joining us mostly. Rain is equal. 39% saying it lifts their moods, 39% saying it lowers their moods. And wind, slight emphasis on that lowering their moods, like you, Trevor. Although perhaps they don't have that's association, that isn't it there? The wind and your realization that you might be feeling in a depressed state. Is that an associative combination?
It is, but I think there are other reasons why the wind lowers mood, and that's because it shifts the allergens around in the air. And we know now that mental illness, mental health issues like anxiety and depression are partly that there is a. It isn't the case that there is the mind on top of the brain. There's a complex feedback loop between the brain and the mind, and also the immune system. The immune system turns out to be very powerful in influencing our mood, and our mood, the immune system. And when we get exposed to allergens, pollens, also chemicals, things that the wind moves around, that can cause an inflammatory response. So that tends to make us down as well. And it's
Ah,
been observed that the wind is quite the most anxiety provoking of all weather, partly because of these effects of allergens, partly because people have lots of reason to worry about the wind. I worry that my conservatory is going to fly away. So that's not something you tend to worry about when it's sunny and warm.
but then again, something people can worry about as well are thunderstorms. And I know you said in your book that that was something you felt very anxious about as a young boy, but thunderstorms are scoring highly positive in our research here. We've got 75% saying thunderstorms lift their mood.
Yes, and there are reasons for that because thunderstorms are electrical phenomena, as we know, and the lightning arises because of electrical charge differences between the top and the bottom of the cloud. And these electrical charges brought about by small things called ions are actually the brain is quite sensitive to them. And you might have seen that you can buy things called negative ions generators, which are little devices which generate electrical imbalances in the home and which are supposed to reduce anxiety and lift mood. Now, I should say the research is in an early stage and not everyone agrees with the findings, but it is entirely possible that the electrical activity in storms does affect our mood directly.
Right.
Now, storms are interesting because they are phobia of thunderstorms is the most common phobia in the weather, but in actual fact, it's the third. A study in the United States some time ago showed that thunderstorm phobia was the third most, maybe even the second most common phobia after I think it was animals and insects.
Wow. Okay. So, and then we also asked about hot weather and cold weather. People saying generally feeling negative about hot and humid weather and positive about cold, crisp weather. So that brings us on to talking about the sun, because we can't talk about the relationship between us and the weather without focusing on the sun and sunlight, since the sun drives the weather on our planet. It is the energy not only that drives us all life on the planet, but also the weather on the planet. So the media would have us to believe that blue skies and sunshine is the best weather, the only good weather. That's something we've always fought back against at the Cloud Appreciation Society, feeling that's a very simplistic way of thinking. It's probably about telling people to go on holiday somewhere and buy a flight. When it comes to weather, however, there are positives. So when the sun and sunshine and heat, there are positives and negatives. And let's move on to a negative here with seasonal affective disorder. Now, this is when people have weather, well, sunshine affecting them in such a profound way. Well, tell us what seasonally affective disorder is. I'm not going to define it.
Well, you're right about the sunshine and blue skies being the most popular sort of weather. Some surveys show that that is indeed on average, people's favorite weather, although not hugely so. And of course, sunshine is also correlated with temperature, and people don't like it. People like it warm, but not too hot. And sunshine, I think, has something of a bad rap in the press. Now, it is true that we have to be extremely careful about making sure we don't get sunburn, we don't get reddened skin. We need to take precaution when we're out in the sun, perhaps even in winter. So, as you probably know, it's recommended that between 11 and 3, from spring to autumn, you put some sunblock on. And that's important. But the sun has many beneficial qualities too. And it does actually physiologically uplift mood. It affects a number of chemicals and circuits in the brain. And when these go wrong, when there's not enough sunshine, then we get seasonal affective disorder in winter. Now, one of the things that sunshine does is that it sets our biological clock, our circadian rhythms that make sure that we're alert when it's light and sleepy when it's dark, for obvious reasons of evolutionary benefit. We don't want to be out running around outside when the saber-toothed tigers are out searching for prey.
Yeah.
So we want to sleep in the dark and be awake when it's light. And to do that, to set that rhythm, we need light at the right times of day. And that means light in the mornings. And it also means the right sort of light. It should be blue-white light. That is predominantly what we get with sunshine, which is why sitting in front of a light bulb isn't going to do you much good.
Right.
You need to get light in the mornings at the right time. And in winter, there isn't as much light around. And depending on where you live, it can be pretty miserable. I live in Sidlaw Hills in Scotland, and in the middle winter, when around solstice time, with the hills taken into account, the sun creeps over one hill at 9:30 or so and starts going behind another at 2:30. And at the further north you go, the worse, or perhaps in some cases the better it gets. And so we don't get enough light at that critical time of day. And that means that our biological clock doesn't get set properly. And when our biological clock isn't set properly, all sorts of things start going wrong. We start getting, it affects our mood, it affects our energy levels, it affects our appetite, it makes us depressed. Now, there's a continuum of how strongly people are affected. Some people aren't affected, many people perhaps aren't affected at all. I'd say probably 10% of people report winter blues, where they feel significantly down in the winter, particularly on dull, overcast days. I think dull days are more significant in the middle of winter. And about 1% of the population suffer severely enough that they get a diagnosis of seasonal
Let's
affective disorder.
let's just see again, a very quick poll, yes or no, or don't know, for seasonal affective disorder. Does anyone in our attendees say they do or don't? It'd be interesting to see now that we've had a bit of an idea of what you might define it as. So you're saying that it could be circadian rhythms, also serotonin. That's really
Yes,
good for the brain, right?
as I say, sunshine is good for us in a number of ways. So not only does it reset our biological clock, which involves a complex mechanism of going from the eyes to what is called the pineal gland, which is a small gland deep right in the middle of the brain, right in the middle of your head, and that produces a chemical called melatonin. Now, you might have heard of melatonin because it's a sleep aid. In the United States, they pile shelves high next to them at the checkouts, along with the sweeties, so that you can take them as sleep aids. And so it's important for sleep. And when we're not getting sunshine at the right time of day, then we're not making enough melatonin. It's also sunshine also produces the feel-good chemical, the neurotransmitter, as we call it, serotonin, which is a chemical which is known to be very important for regulating mood. And the class of drugs called serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, such as Prozac, work on the same system. So serotonin is important for maintaining a good mood. Sunshine is even important for blood pressure. When it hits the skin, it produces, again, chemicals which help regulate blood pressure, which can make us feel good as well. So it has many benefits, sunshine. I'm a great fan of it in the morning.
And I want to go on because we can see there we've got 27% of people saying they think they suffer from SAD, seasonal affective disorder. 61 say no, they don't feel it. 12% don't know either way. Before we talk a little bit practically about what those who do suffer from this might do, could you just say there's this thing called reverse SAD? So that's when you're not feeling down in the winter and up in the summer, but almost the other way around. When it's sunny weather, you feel a little bit lower. Is that what reverse SAD is?
Yes, reverse SAD is exactly as the name implies. It's people who get seasonal affective disorder symptoms, but in the summer. And as I say, in winter here, it's very dark in the mornings and night in winter, but in summer, the sunshine is at 4:30 in the morning and it's still light outside at midnight.
Mm.
And as we need light in the morning to set our biological clock, too much light late in the evening or afternoon interferes with setting the biological clock. It's almost telling the brain at midnight, this is morning. And of course, it isn't. So the brain gets confused. And in a proportion of the population, about 1% of people, that confusion is enough to cause the symptoms of seasonal affective disorder.
Mm.
Interestingly, the symptoms are slightly different with reverse affective disorder. The symptoms that are worse tend to be inertia, people not having the motivation to do anything, and also appetite dysregulation. They tend to eat much more in the summer,
Mm.
whereas
Okay.
for other people, it's the other way around usually.
I sometimes wonder whether, I sometimes wonder when it's bright sunshine the whole time. For me, I don't necessarily feel like this is amazing. I prefer it when we've got clouds, and I actually quite like a rainy day. Anyway, that's that's nothing. That's beside the point. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was something practical, which is what can people who suffer from SAD do? Now, I know there's stuff to do with practical light boxes and stuff. And I'd love to just very quickly hear you mention a few of those. But also, what can we learn from societies in the far north and their attitude to the winter months?
Fortunately, we are not powerless if you have seasonal affective disorder. Now, I should, of course, say that if you're severely depressed, you should always seek out clinical help. And there's this medication might help or might be necessary. But if you're just suffering from the winter blues and want to try something, first of all, you can buy what are called light boxes. And you've probably seen these. I have one, just happen to have one here. beside me, even though it's middle of summer. I mean, middle of spring, there's a light box, and it has a very bright light which simulates sunshine. Now, in the old days, I remember my wife got one in about 1997, and it's a huge box and it costs £300. Whereas now you can get these online for about £30. And then they just simulate sunshine and it gives you the same benefit. So you use them in the morning. Another thing you can do is take vitamin D supplementation because vitamin D, as well as being involved in producing healthy bones, is also involved in mood regulation and in producing serotonin. And we don't get enough of it in winter in this country. So you can have oily fish. There's a limit to how much oily fish you can eat. So in this country, vitamin D supplementation is recommended in winter. And the other
Never,
thing I think
does
is
it
very
come in?
important is getting outside,
Yeah,
exposing yourself to nature. We'll probably talk about this a bit
yeah,
later,
yeah.
but having a morning walk and avoiding bright lights and blue lights in particular in the afternoon and evening. So if your phone has a red light setting, use it.
Yeah, great. We've got to move on, but just before we do, I wanted to say there are some studies mentioned in your book about um, people's, often indigenous people's traditions in the far north, which interested me. There's the Norwegian word for embracing winter, kurslig. And this is sort of accept this idea of acceptance and embracing something that you can't change. That's important, right?
Yes, it is. And acceptance has become a very important concept in counseling and in psychotherapy. The idea that there are things we can't change in the world, and there are things about ourselves which are immutable. So rather than fight them, we accept them. And there's a particularly famous study called the Tromsø study, which not surprisingly was carried out in Tromsø in Norway. And you would expect that as you get to the far north, seasonal affective disorder would get worse. But the people in the Tromsø area seem to have developed a way of fighting it off, and that is by seeing the benefits to winter. So they do things like they take part in winter sports, they congregate around fires and have social events, they take advantage of the weather and they don't fight it. And again, that's something I think we can learn. And I have learned to enjoy the way in which it gets dark here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I take an afternoon nap, and I quite like the fact that it's dark when I'm having an afternoon nap. So there are minor things we can do that enable us to adjust to the weather as it is that day.
Yeah. And I think it's yeah we hopefully will return to that because that idea of acceptance is central to the reason why weather is such a great metaphor for our emotions because it's something that's out of our control, right? And it's something that seems to happen to us, and our reaction to our mental health and our emotional health can feel like that, right? But the irony is, you say if you accept aspects of the way you're feeling and kind of accept that it's beyond your control, there's an irony in the sense that then does affect it in some way and for the better, right?
That's exactly right. And although we can't control the weather, fortunately, we can take advantage of whatever weather there is outside by seeing that every sort of weather, except perhaps from wind, but everything else, even rain, we've seen that lots of people like rain. Rain does have some psychological benefits. So if it's raining now, I think, well, there's no point feeling down about it. I've still got to walk Bo, the little poodle. So I go out and I enjoy the rain now. It's taken a long time to get to that state because my inclination is to like most people, sunny, dry, blue sky weather.
Yeah. Well, that brings us on to clouds. Now, this is I know that you talked. We don't have time to mention them. You talked about how problems with heat can. There are all sorts of ways that heat can trigger difficulties and greater riots, sort of mental health problems with heat and all sorts of suicide with hot weather. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in your book. Alas, we don't have time to go into those now because I wanted to talk about clouds since it's the Cloud Appreciation Society speaking here. um, you described the first flight, the first time you went up in an aircraft when you were a young boy in the Combined Cadet Force. And that was a moment of amazement for you when it came to the clouds. What do you remember vividly about that
Yeah,
experience?
I was about, I think, 14, 15 or so, and we had this CCF at school, Combined Cadet Force, and you had to do it unless you could get out of it by going to the as you can tell, I wasn't very keen on the idea of doing it because you could get out of it if you could get into the school orchestra, but sadly you had to play an instrument for that, and I couldn't. And they tried, the three arms of the CCF tried to entice you with something. And the I remember the Navy enticed you with the possibility of going down in a submarine underwater, which sounded pretty claustrophobic and horrible. The army said you could go in a tank, which again I can't really see why anyone would want to go in a
But you went
tank.
up in a plane.
But I got to go up in a plane, and it was a
Yeah.
small Cessna, and it just took off from a local aerodrome, and which happened to be quite near our house. And I'd never been in a plane before, and I thought the first emotion was amazement when the wheels left the ground, and I thought we're in the air. And I knew it was going to happen, but I still couldn't believe it. And we went up quite quickly. And almost immediately, we were circling around my mother's house. And I looked down, and there she was with the washing, putting it out, blowing in the wind. But then there was a bank of cumulus clouds, and we went up through them. And it was just absolutely amazing to go through these things I had always admired. And I was surprised by, on the one hand, how insubstantial they were, because when you're up close, they don't have the hard edges that they look like low down. They're wispy and soft, but on the other, they also do buffet the plane about a bit. And even jets, you often notice that when you're going through thick cloud, there's a bit of turbulence and vibration.
Hmm.
So there was this contrast between being impressive, big, and insubstantial, but also directly there.
Yeah, and they're enticingly contradictory. So, I mean,
Yeah.
clouds are psychologically unusual, I think, possibly because, they're constantly changing. They're impossible for you to kind of grasp or possess, and they're often, like, as you say, enormous in scale. What do you think clouds uniquely provide on an emotional level that other parts of nature do not? If we talk about being engaged with nature.
Clouds are interesting because, as you say, they're quite common, pretty perhaps too common in some places for some people, but they are also ever changing and unpredictable. And in some ways, I think they're the most unpredictable thing that most people are exposed to when they look at nature. And so there's always something different to see. There's always some beauty to appreciate. And each cloud and each cloud type has its own particular attraction. The only one I can't get too worked up about is altostratus, except for when you can see the sun through it. But every other sort has its own particular beauty, charm, even.
I
And
like to think of
looking
them
at
as
these things,
personalities as well.
yes, yes, looking at them, and you can almost imagine what the voices they would have if they could speak.
Yeah.
And they therefore provide us with this really direct contact with nature.
So let's do another quick poll, Ali, if that's possible. The one about emotions in the sky. I just want to hear what our attendees feel about different aspects of the sky, how they um, which ones they feel emotionally most emotionally connected to when it comes to the sky. And we're talking about things like watching dramatic storm clouds, watching fair weather cumulus clouds drifting across the sky, the sunsets or sunrises, or rain or snowfall, whether you see rainbows and optical effects as being how you're most connected to the sky, or if it's clear blue skies, that mean a lot. We've got no one saying, Trevor, that they're emotionally unconnected to the sky. So that's good to hear.
Yeah.
But let
Well, there
me,
are reasons for as well why we should be emotionally connected because blue skies, the sense of vastness above us are things which have been shown to be psychologically uplifting. So there's good experimental evidence that says why looking at the clouds and sky should be good for us. I think
well,
it's free treatment.
free treatment and a free connection to awe. Now, I
Yes.
wanted to move on to awe for a moment because You said there's no easier way of bringing awe into our lives than by observing the weather. And certainly when it comes to clouds, one reason I imagine why people loved storm clouds in our earlier poll, and the reason why people love looking at it as a dramatic sunset is this sense of awe, the sense of it. We're observing something, we're experiencing something that's far greater than us. There is evidential, empirical, academic study suggesting that this is good for our mental health, the sense of awe. Is that correct?
That's correct. There are, in fact, several studies that show that awe is important. And now it's a bit of a growth industry in looking at how exposure to nature is good for our mental health. Just being having a window that can look out at greenery or the sky improves mental health. It helps recovery times in hospital. Being exposed to nature and particularly getting outside and enjoying nature is very good for our mental health. But I think awe is not only is awe important for our well-being, it does something a bit more. And I think the sky is important because, as you say, there is so much drama in there. The light can be so dramatic. Looking at the sky gives us this sense of vastness of something above us, as you said, bigger than ourselves. It's similar, you've probably heard about how astronauts in space look back at the Earth and they have a sense of almost a religious experience. And that is very similar to looking at a dramatic sky. It reminds us that, in a way, we're insignificant. There's this hugeness around us, and that can be life-changing.
And it also puts our problems into perspective in a way that I think must be important. So just before we move on,
yeah, it's certainly been shown that for example, people suffering from terminal illness who have exposure to awe and those sort of experiences that it produce come to accept tend to be happier and accept their shortened lifespan more. So it is extremely beneficial for us.
Okay, so very, very quickly, the results of that emotions in the sky poll showed that 72% liked watching storm clouds. That was the greatest. And then the sunsets and sunrises affected people greatly. Clear blue skies least affected. I mean, I could have written this because it's obvious with the Cloud Appreciation Society. And then a night under stars is important to people as well. Rainbows, optical effects. In fact, they love them all. So that's good to see. Just move it. We've got to move on to the climate, the changing climate, because, we talk about weather changing this way and that, and everything's only around for a while. The great lesson from weather is if it's raining now, it won't be tomorrow or in a few days. If it's hot today, after a while, the heat wave will pass. It doesn't apply when it comes to climate change. And I wanted to talk to you about eco-anxiety or climate change anxiety. Your book argues that, well, firstly, is climate change anxiety something that is equally experienced across all age ranges? Let's look at that firstly.
No, there is now a lot of evidence that people are increasingly suffering from eco-anxiety, particularly about climate change, to the extent that some people are feeling incapacitated about it or need help with clinical help. As obviously some occupations suffer more, agricultural workers, farmers suffer from it particularly. But in terms of the population as a whole, generally the younger you are, the more likely you are to be anxious about climate change. For obvious reasons, I think the climate I've seen across I hope I still have many years left, but I've experienced some wonderful winters. I remember the winter of 62, 63, the snow of 78, 79, low temperatures of 81, the great winter of 2010, and I fear that we will perhaps never see anything like that again.
Yeah, and so let's just do a quick poll, Ali, if we can, to see how people how feelings of our changing climate affect people. So just let's see what our attendees of the Zoom webinar think about that. I'll share the results in a minute. Can you, so you're saying some professions like farmers are going to be suffering from this more likely.
They already
Also,
are.
indigenous communities
Yes.
in some regions of the world will be particularly affected, and so it's going to have a particular importance and therefore effect on their mental health. What practical things can people do, and particularly young people, if they're going to be suffering from this more? Is there something we can do to alleviate eco-anxiety?
Yes, and all of these things, a sense of agency is important, a sense that we are making a difference. If we feel completely helpless, then that will just make anxiety worse. And there are things we can do, such as by lobbying, by talking to people, by trying to explain things, by making small changes in our own lives, by turning the thermostat down or with the way things are going, we won't need heating in winter much longer, but we'll turn the air conditioning down, it will probably be. So anything we can do that we think makes a difference will help. Now, of course, some of the things we do aren't going to make a huge difference. If I turn my thermostat down a bit and no one else does, that won't make any practical difference. But
Hmm.
it will give me a sense of control. And if I can persuade other people to make that change too, then it will be even more beneficial. So taking control and engaging with the population, lobbying politicians, all of these things help immensely.
And understanding as well. And I think that's
Yes.
something we're going to have to move on to the last bit because we're out of time. But understanding, I think, is very important. For me, with the Cloud Appreciation Society, we've been doing it for 20 years. It's been about the emotional connection to the sky, but it has also been about understanding the science of the sky, the science of our atmosphere and how clouds form, because I think that it does, again, give you a sense of agency and a sense of understanding about what's happening, which isn't necessarily going to make things worse. It can actually give you more of a sense of agency. Let's just finally move on to acceptance. So, you talked earlier on about how accepting the way our emotions come and go is a little bit sort of mirrored in a way to accepting weather at the moment. Um, how what does the weather and in particular the sky teach us about acceptance, and how is paying attention to the weather the way you can deal with a difficult emotions in your own life?
I think the weather is unique in that it is a combination of permanence and transience. We know there's always going to be weather, but we don't know what it's going to be. And we know that when the things we can engage with the weather, we can take advantage of it. But I think it's important to accept that whatever the weather, there is something good about it.
Yeah, and you describe a moment in the book after you recovered. It was a near-death experience. You were recovering from sepsis, and you were driving home, and the evening light was shining on your way home from the hospital. Can you tell us about that moment? Is that a peak experience? That moment, what did it mean for you? What resulted from it in your case?
Yes, I did indeed have sepsis, and it was quite severe. It could have been worse, but it was still a brush with death. And coming home from the hospital, I live in the Sidlaw Hills, and when you come down from the summit of the hills on the way home, you have the Cairngorm Mountains spread in front of you. And it so happened that at that moment, just as coming into sight of the hills, there was a gap in the clouds, and the sunshine lit up a patch of snow on one of the distant mountains. And I just remember, I can see it vividly now. It's another example of a flashbulb memory. It was just an extremely powerful emotion. It indeed induced one of these states of awe. And we talk about peak experiences. Maslow, for example, wrote about them. And peak experiences are experiences which, if you like, are as high above the normal state of consciousness as being sleep or dreaming is below. And having these altered states of consciousness, as I think I mentioned earlier, first of all, they give us a completely different perspective on the world. They change us as people for the better, and they are good for our health. They help us to accept our place in the world, they accept that we won't be here forever, and to recognize that there are things we can do. There are wholly positive things. And it was an extremely vivid experience. And it actually changed my life as well, because then I thought, well, I want to do more things that involve looking at the weather. I don't want to be dean anymore. I don't want to be an academic. I don't want to make myself ill with overwork. So I decided to give up the day job and become a full-time writer and weather expert. And I feel much, much happier for it.
Wonderful.
Everyone should do it.
So you
But at the
said
very least, finding these opportunities for peak experiences in the sky, clouds, the weather, they provide more opportunities, I think, than anything else around us in everyday life. Give us these opportunities to provide ourselves with the motivation for change.
Wonderful. So, and you said that in the book, you felt that if the world would be a better place if more people paid more attention to the sky, and we couldn't agree more. So, thank you
I
so
don't
much.
feel it, I know it.
Thank you so much. Listen, there are so many questions, and we would love to get to some of those before we want to try and wrap this up on time. So we would love to just get to those if possible. So is it Ali? Are you going to join us again?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just join you from the audio so that we don't mess up the visuals for people. So I can start with a very quick one. Maybe it's not so easy. I'm not sure, but Betty asks, when will your book come out, Trevor?
Thursday.
Yeah.
There you go, Betty. Thursday.
It's available for pre-order now, but it should hit the shelves.
So you really good. And by the way, there's so much we've mentioned in here, lots of sort of studies in passing, but of course, Trevor's got all the references in there. So if you want to know the study about people in Tromsø and why they enjoy the nighttime, even though it's never day in the winter, you can see the studies in there. It's all in the
Yes, I think most people are proud of their books, but I'm particularly proud of it because it does the combination of weather, personal anecdote, and the science. And I have tried to reference everything in there. Sometimes we don't know the answers. This is still quite a young field. So there are gaps, but I've tried to provide a reference for everything that is there.
All right, Ali, what's next?
That's great. So there was some discussion in the chat when you were talking about seasonal affective disorder that I found quite interesting about specifically about the reverse seasonal affective disorder. And a couple of people, I think Mary and also Margot, were interested to know whether humidity was actually a big part of that, because they had found that humidity affected them quite a lot.
Yes, well, of course, seasonal change isn't a simple thing. It isn't as simple as sunny in winter, dark in winter, sunny in summer. Sunshine drives the weather, and therefore it causes other changes. And in winter, it's cold, which actually is quite good for mental health. But in summer, it is obviously going to be hotter, and there's going to be more humidity. And generally, with most phenomena in the weather, there's this optimum point. We don't want it to be too dry, but we don't want it to be too humid. And in summer, it's particularly increasingly with climate change, it can be too humid. And yes, the evidence shows that humidity is bad for people's mental health. It makes people anxious, it makes us irritable, it makes us bad-tempered, and it lowers our mood. So those things, independently of the amount of light, are important. You're quite right.
That's great. And another one that was really nice, I thought, was talking about from Don, kind of asking about whether weather from the place you're used to or accustomed to or grew up in is going to affect you differently to the weather in places that maybe you're visiting or have come back to after a long time, and whether that can have adverse or positive effects.
I have thought about this because I grew up in the south of England, and I remember it being sunny, warm, with thunderstorms every day, which of course can't be right. And so it has been quite. I moved here to East Scotland about 30 years ago, and the climate is very different. The only thing is that surprises most people is how dry and sunny it is in summer. But I do miss the south. I miss particularly the very warm days, and I particularly miss the very warm nights. Whenever I visit my brother in Southampton, we go out to the cafes at night, and you can sit outside in the street in your shorts I've tried doing that here as an experiment, and it's just impossible for me anyway. So
There's
yes,
also,
it does make me feel nostalgic for the weather I grew up in, and I do miss it. And of course, nostalgia is a complex emotion, but it can make us feel a bit miserable too. So yes, I think we do miss the weather we're used to as
and there's
children.
also, I imagine there's an extent, you know, if we're talking about awe and surprise and an element of being in the moment, people can take for granted what they're used to the whole time. I mean, I was very surprised when we do cloud holidays or sky holidays rather, sky holidays with the Cloud Appreciation Society. We've done some to see the Northern Lights, and we did some to the Northwest Territories of Canada. And it was interesting to speak to the Dene people, some of the people in the community, the Dene people up there, about the Northern Lights. And they were like, oh, yeah, not too bothered about them. See them the whole time. Do you know what I mean? They really were like indifferent about it. And yet, you know, people from lower latitudes will cross the world to see them and stand in awe and amazement. It's a real sense of awe when you see an amazing display. So it's all about context, isn't it?
It
And
is.
it's all about getting out of your everyday.
And Aurora is particularly interesting. I think they're still amazing, but my partner who lives in the south has never seen them. And whenever she's up here, it's usually sadly cloudy at night.
I know,
But
darn
now
cloud.
seen that. I've now, particularly now it's a sunspot minimum. I've seen them so many times that I don't always bother unless it's a red alert on the app to
Yeah,
go even and check.
great. Ali, what's next?
Well, I think our conversation about humidity maybe stimulated some people in the chat to also ask about low pressure and how it affects both their physical health and also potentially their mental health.
There is evidence that it affects both. And of course, low pressure is associated with rain and wind. So they're these confounding variables, as we call them. So you can't just experience low pressure by itself, not in the natural world anyway. But there is particularly evidence that low pressure affects arthritis and maybe headaches as well, and maybe migraine headaches. And the mechanisms aren't very well understood. It might be something for arthritis, it might be something to do with the pressure actually affecting the way fluid in the joints circulates. So it isn't well understood, but yes, it definitely does affect us. And in the same way, thunderstorms, the electromagnetic activity can affect us. Aurora, even, there is some evidence that the way in which the Earth's geomagnetic activity is affected can give some people headaches. So there are all these connections, but they're not well understood, and not everyone experiences them. But with arthritis and pressure changes, definitely.
Great.
Headaches too.
What's that?
Headaches too. They
Oh,
cause
hey.
headaches.
Ali, what's next?
I think this is a really nice angle and maybe could start a really nice discussion. So Barbara says or asks, how does weather affect people who have different circadian rhythms? So she tends to be a night owl and stays up late and sleeps late. But maybe other people with different rhythms are affected in different ways, in different latitudes and different conditions.
Yes, with all of these things, there are individual differences in, first of all, people's constitution, the makeup, as you say, morning larks and night owls, when you want to sleep, when you get your sleep, and essentially what is going to interfere with the routine you want to have is important. So if you like sleeping and getting up late in the morning and it's summer and it's bright light at 5 a.m., then that is going to be disruptive. On the other hand, if you like staying up late at night and it's light still at 11 o'clock, then it's not going to have so much of a pernicious effect. And the opposite is going to be true in in winter. But as I say, there are all these individual differences. We all differ in terms of our personality, and we all live in different places. We all experience different climates. So it's very complex. It's a complex system. And in a way, I think that's why so many of these results from the area are preliminary, or why there hasn't been so much research. It's difficult to do. You need large populations.
Yeah, brilliant. So many questions coming in, Ali. What else have you got?
We have an interesting one from Federica, who maybe questions a bit more the terminology and some of the low level stuff in this conversation. So she's asking, what do you actually mean by mood? And what do would anxiety be classified as a mood? Because she's saying that potentially, for example, thunderstorms could raise feelings of anxiety or feelings of tension in a person.
I wouldn't say that anxiety is separate from mood. Mood is simply how positive or negative we feel, how happy or depressed is that continuum of emotion. Whereas anxiety is how agitated we are, and they are different. Now, although they're different, they are also correlated in that anxiety and depression tend to go together. But you can be depressed without being anxious, and you can be anxious without being depressed. And things like some aspects of the weather might provoke one of those emotions, but not others. So you're quite right to say that they should be disentangled. It can be quite difficult doing that in practice, given that in many people they tend to co-occur.
Great.
And then another interesting weather effect that I hadn't heard of before, but a few people have mentioned this in different places. Is there any work that you've done or looked at into the phone effect, which I believe is a wind caused by mountain ranges?
Yes, it is, and it's a drying wind, and there's been quite a lot of that and similar winds across the world. In fact, the journalist Joan Didion's first essay was on the Santa Ana wind in California, which is very similar, and how that affects people. And yes, these drying winds are very disruptive, and they have been associated with quite a lot of largely detrimental psychological changes. So we find, for example, that when the foehn wind blows, the number of car accidents goes up. People's concentration is affected, their mood drops, they become more anxious. I think even crime goes up. But the way in which the actual wind has that effect isn't one of these things that is very well understood. One possibility is that it's to do with the very low humidity for that wind. Another possibility is that it's to do with the surplus of positive ions. And I said earlier that negative ions that you get with rain and thunderstorm are good for mood and anxiety. The opposite is true of positive ions. And so they might be having some effect. But yes, there are definitely effects, but why they happen, we don't fully understand.
And there's so many contradictions, aren't there? Because you were saying that still and humid weather is bad for your mental state, but moving dry weather is bad for your mental state. There's no simple rules here, are there?
Well, there is generally a simple rule, which is that we like optimum things. We like somewhere in the middle of the range. We don't, too dry is bad for us, too humid is bad for us, too cold is bad for us, too warm is
Oh yeah.
bad for us. The optimum temperature seems to be about 20, 21 degrees, which, as I think Henry James observed, is a perfect summer's day in England. So we blessed with the weather that is optimum. Sadly, with climate change, it's getting to be not the common day, more like it's going to soon be there a good January day.
So, Alistair, a couple more, do you think, time for?
Well, we've got one
Quick
very
one.
quick one that maybe we can end on, which pulls it back to the book as well, which is your book available worldwide, or someone's asking from the US specifically?
Yes, it's
Oh,
coming out in the US in a couple, I think coming out in a couple of weeks' time. It's early July for the book, and it's available hardback, Kindle, and audio book versions. So you should be able to get it anywhere, and it is worldwide, and it's been translated into languages too. I know that the German translations will be out very soon.
So it's thank you for that, Ali. I think we probably have to. I like to do things on time because people, it's the end of the day on Friday here in the UK. I know people have expected this to be an hour, so we should probably wrap it up. Um, Trevor, it was fascinating from my point of view to find out about this. I've known for so long the emotional connection we have to the sky. What has interested me was in our discussion, but also in the book, is seeing the science behind that emotional connection, the science behind the way the weather, and in particular, in our case, the sky, can govern our moods. And there were some real lessons I felt from what you told us and what you shared in this discussion about acceptance. The weather's always changing. Whatever we're feeling at the moment is going to be passing. It's such a simple rule, but it is so important to learn, isn't it?
It is, and we should enjoy the weather, whatever it is.
Yeah. And thank you so much for joining us,
It's
Trevor.
been a pleasure. It's good to speak to people who love the weather as much as I do.
Great, and thank you, Ali, and the Asterisk Lab for hosting this discussion. And of course, thank you everybody for joining us both in the Zoom webinar and also on the streams on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. It's been great having you all here, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day and weekend. And don't forget to keep looking up and engaging with the sky. It means a lot to you on an emotional level. Bye-bye.